Of La Gemara, today's daf, this is Friday's daf on base. We'll begin daf on Aleph on base on the bottom of the page. Father Rabbanon, 4 lines at the bottom. We learned, Ein mekablin pikdonis, you should not accept a pekadon, an object, leimin hanashim, and to mine for them, not from women, v'lei min avodim, and not from slaves, v'lei min hatanekis, not from children. Because in each of these cases, we are concerned that perhaps the item does not belong to them, it belongs to husband, master, father, and therefore they had no right to give it to you. So you shouldn't take it. But if you did take it, kibul min isha, if you did take it, yachzil isha, give it back to her. Give it back to her, because you don't know for sure it's not hers. And obviously she's claiming it is, so therefore you have no right to give it to anybody else. The e mesa, but if she died, you took it from her when she was married, then she died, then yachzil baila, you return it to the husband, because regardless, even if it was hers, he's the one who yashins her, so therefore you give it back to the husband. Kibul min eved, you received it from a slave, yachzil eved, give it back to the slave. Be mace, and if the slave died, yachzil rabbi, give it back to the master. Even though it's possible that it belongs to the slaves, but nevertheless, what do you call it? Nevertheless, since the master owns whatever he has, it goes to the master. If the Rashbam and some Rishonim make a distinction that other Rishonim have a hard time understanding, and that is, what happens if a married woman gives you an object to mind, and then she's divorced, and who you give it back, and then she dies, so you give it back to the woman's heirs. But if a slave gave you an object to mind, and then he was set free, and he died, you give it back to the master. And they try to understand, why not to the slave's heirs? If he has children, why not to the slave's heirs? What's the difference in the case of the slave or the wife? As if to say there's a much greater chance in the case of the slave that it probably belongs to the master. So even though he was set free and then he died, we'll give it back to the master. But when it comes to a wife, it's not so common. It's not necessarily so, and therefore, if she claimed as hers and you have to give it back to her, if she was divorced, you give it back to her, and if she dies, it goes to her heirs. This law does not, by a wife today, has changed a lot in the sense that since women have the right, as we learned before, Rav Huna says, women have the right to say that they work for themselves and they earn everything they earn is their own. So then the prospect that it's not hers is much lower. But in Shulchan Aruch, interesting, in Hilchot Tzedakah, I think there it says that from a wife, if you take tzedakah from her, you should take only small amounts, not large amounts, because large amounts she has to console the husband. But again, today, if she works, then obviously she has the right to do with her money whatever she wants. Then the Gemara continues. Kibul min hakotten. If you received a pekadon from a child, you don't give it back to the child. Yaseloi segula, you put it aside for later on, and to protect the child from him. Now, why? Like you put in a trust fund, but why don't you give back to the child itself? Some people say that you're not allowed to give back to the child, because as soon as the child cannot mind it, you have a mitzvah of hashava to give it back. And if you give it back to the child, it's not considered giving it back, because he can't mind it. It doesn't matter that he had it in his possession, but now you have the mitzvah of hashava, and you can't do hashava to a child who's not mature enough. So therefore, other Rishonim say, no, you could give back to the child, but it's to lotzei sidei shemayim, to do the right thing. You should hold on to it and give it to him later. We'll see later in what form. The mace, and if he died, yachzil yoshim, and if they died, including the child, we give it to the yoshim. And here the Mefarshim have a difficult time. Why do you give it to the yoshim? Give it back to his father. So someone say we're talking about a child who's a yassim, and someone say there's a difference whether the child is under 6 years old or over 6 years old, and the difference in the outcomes. The kulan she'amru b'shas mitzvos, all of them, if they say on the deathbed, shel ploni hein, it belongs to that person. Yaseh kippurushin, carry out their wishes, because either, like some explain, people don't lie on their deathbed and are saying the truth, and therefore you follow whatever they tell you to say. And plus, could have said it's her own, and instead it says give it to somebody else. You trust them. But the lav yaseh pirush leperusha. But if, let's say, you don't believe this person, that you don't believe her, that it actually comes from that person. You actually really suspect that it's from her husband, or the other, you don't really believe in that it came from that person. Then you interpret their words. In other words, give it back to the person that you think it really belongs to. The Visu the Rabbi Chana, the wife of Rabbi Chana, when she was dying on a deathbed, she said, Hani Kipi, these earrings that I have, the Marta Ubene Marta. They come from a person called Marta, and the children of her daughter. Also the Kamei Rav. Marta was a brother of Rab Chia. So they came before Rav, which means that Marta was the first cousin of Rav, because Rav was a nephew of Rab Chia. His father, Avoy, and Rab Chia, and Marta were brothers. So this is his first cousin. Came to Rav, Amalei. So he said to the husband, when she was on a deathbed, he wanted to know the earring. Should he give it back to Marta? Can he inherit it? Amalei said, if you trust her, then I say kippurusha. Do as she says. But if you don't trust her, that actually came from Marta, then I say Peter's Barusha, and reinterpret the words and say this probably came from you, or you took your money and bought it yourself. Others say, Hacham, this is what he said. If Marta is well to do or well enough financially that it could be that it's possible the earrings belong to them, then I say kippurusha. Adhere to her requests or wishes. But the Eloi, otherwise, I say Pirush Liperusha. Reinterpret and say it does not come from Marta, probably took my funds and keep it. Then the Raisa said, Min hakotten yasla is gula. You don't return it to the child, but you make his gula. What does gula mean? My sigula, what exactly is that? Rav Chizda Amar Sefer Torah. Buy him a Sefer Torah. Why a Sefer Torah? Because the Sefer Torah itself is an item that won't lose value, and plus he has a benefit right now, because he can sit and learn from it. So give him a Sefer Torah. And Rabba Barabhuna says, Dikla the Ochal Minei Tamra. A palm tree, give him a palm tree that he can eat the dates. Again, the tree itself, is fixed, it has longevity, and it will always be there. And meantime, he can also have benefit, he can eat from the dates. Then we say, V'loyla of benichse haben, v'loyla ben benichse av. We don't give the father has no chazaka when it comes to the assets of the son. You know why the son didn't protest? It's his father. How can he protest? Doesn't matter how many years you were there. And the same thing is, if a son makes a chazak against his father, the father didn't protest against the son. Amar Rabbi Yisrael says, Afilu cholka, even if the son no longer lives at home. Nevertheless, there has such a close bond between the father and the son that the father won't protest if he sees his son there, nor will the son protest against his father if he sees him there. So there's no chazak here. You buy something from your son or your father, make sure you retain that document, the contract. Rabbi says, Rabbi disagrees. He says, if they are no longer, if the son is an independent, no longer dependent on his father's largesse, then his father would have protested if he moved in for 3 years on his field, and he should have protested. That's what Rabbi says. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Yimedifta said, Rapapi actually behaved. He actually ruled in his courts that Chilka, if the son is no longer dependent on his father, then there's no, it's not right, and there is a chazaka in that case of a son. The father should have protested, or the son should have protested. In other words, Rabbi, exactly like Rabbi rules, not like Rabbi Yosef. So the Gemara, from the city of Hurmiz Ashdadi told me the story later of Yaakov, Acha, the son of Yaakov, told in the name of Nachman, the son of Yaakov, and could be their brothers. But we have a machlekes. Remember, we had before, we discussed 3 days ago, Tosfos and Rashi in a few places. If Rab Nachman by Yaakov is actually the famous Rab Nachman, and interesting, Tosfos always says that every time. His proof is every time that it says Nachman's the name without a father, the only time it says his father's name is when there's another Rab Nachman, like Nachman by Yitzchak or Nachman by Yaakov. But well, right here you have Rab Nachman by Yaakov, and there's no other Rab Nachman here. So So this might is approved to Rashi. There's a person called Nachman Yaakov, and there's a person called Nachman Yitzchak, and the Nachman Yitzchak might be Rav Nachman. Not every time it says Rav Nachman without his father's name. Because right here you have his father's name, even though there's no other person, unless the Gemara wanted to show that they were brothers. Chilkul loy, that if the son is longer dependent, no longer is it considered so then the father should protest it, and that's the halacha. Chilkul loy, that if the son is independent, the father should protest it. Tanya Nami Hachi, we actually learned Ben Shecholak, if the son is independent, Ish is Gasha, the wife is divorced, they're like anybody else, and they should have protested against each other. The Chiddush is not about a wife and divorce, because obviously they don't get on and they should have protested. The Chiddush is even a child, a son. If he's independent, even though it's his father, he should have told his father, hey, I never sold to you and you have no chazak. Says going further, Itmar, a fascinating case. So here you have a Yerusha, there's an inheritance, and you have a case where one brother, I guess the oldest brother, the most astute, he helps his father out in the business, and therefore a lot of things are in his name. And later, when the father dies, the son claims that all of those things that are in the contract that are in his name he was not acting on behalf of the family, he was acting on behalf of himself, they belong to him. And the other brothers say, no, you're acting on behalf of the family, and therefore we should divide it equally. So what do we do in this case? So we learned one of the brothers, he did all the business in the family, and there were all kinds of contracts, like sale contracts or starters, contractual loans. They're all in his name. And he claimed Shaliyah. They happen to be mine. Where did you get the money to invest in all this, whatever it is, real estate? So he argued, base Aviima. You're right. If this brother is, they all live come from the same parents, and how in the world does he have more money than they do? But it's talking about his mother was a different woman, and he says that my mother's father, in other words, my side of the family, nothing to do with you, it bequeathed me a sum of money, and that's what I've been using to purchase and to invest and so on. So who do we believe? Amar Rav said, oh, love lahavi araya. Rav says, well, we believe that this brother is acting on behalf of all his other brothers. And if he argues that he was acting on his own, let him prove that he used his own money. Even though the stars are on his name, in all probability, he's working with his father, in all probability, he did it on behalf of the whole family. And we're talking about a case here where he doesn't have any others. They didn't start dividing the estate yet. Because if they started dividing the estate, he can say, well, I took that money and I invested it. So they can't have any tinus. Talking about a case where they did not divide the estate at all. And he's claiming he got another source altogether, so he has to prove it. That's one. Especially we know that all of these assets come from his father, so now he is taking away from them. So this brother has to prove it. However, Shmuel says, Shmuel says, what do you mean? You have a clear-cut star. The star is written on his name, and he explained where his source of the funds came from. So therefore, he doesn't have to prove anything. It's the other brothers who have to prove that he's a liar and that he used his father's money. Says the Gemara, Shmuel says that even Rav argues, he says that the one who's claiming all of the assets has to prove it. But Moidli Abba, Rav, Moidli, but the real name was Abba. And they called him Rav, which was Rashbam says here, another Shayim. They called him Rav because just like Rebbe, Rehuda Nasi was the main teacher in Yisrael, Rav was the main teacher in Babel. We had to get in Navav. It says that Mechiyasa Rav LaBabel, and according to some Rishonim, it means that Rav made it all happen. He transformed Babel into the place of learning that went on for many hundreds and hundreds of years later through the Goinim and so on. Others say no, his real name was Rav. Abba was a term of endearment. And they follow the opinion that in Gemara and Gittin, it wasn't Rab who brought the Torah. In fact, it was brought many years earlier, at the end of the first base of Mikdash, when Golos Yakum, they brought Hachedesh Hamizgar. They're the ones who brought all the learning academies into Babel. And his real name was Rav, and Abba was just a term of endearment. So Shmuel said that Rav would be major to me. Baidali Abba, She'im Mace, that if the brother, what do you call it? The brother who's made a claim, who claimed all the assets died. Now his children are claiming the assets. In that case, it is the responsibility of the brothers to prove him a liar, because we have a rule. We advocate on behalf of the heirs, so therefore we're going to advocate on behalf that maybe the father did own everything. Maskara Papa doesn't make sense. Klum Tainina Liliasim meet the turn level doesn't make sense. If the father would have been alive and he said it's all mine, we just ruled, Rav ruled that we don't believe the father. He has to prove that it belongs to him. So now that he died, we're going to advocate on behalf of the children belong to the father. We cannot argue for the children something the father himself wouldn't be believed in. Even though we did learn before that if they can prove the father lived there for one day and the children had a chazaka, we're going to advocate, and even though they don't know if the father bought or didn't buy it, we're going to advocate on their behalf, because that's not a problem. Because if the father said he lived there for one day, if he was alive, we would believe it. But it wouldn't help him, because where's his chazaka? Where's his shtar? But now that the children take the father's taina, plus they themselves remain there for 3 years, that's a different case altogether. We will advocate on behalf of the heirs. Says the Gemara, apik zuge de sabla rava. What happened was, we know for a fact that these scissors or these Agadata books belong to Reuven, and then somehow or another ended up by Shimon. Shimon claims he bought it, but he has no evidence. So Rava went and extricated these things from Shimon's rishus, and he said, "Prove that it's yours." Why we have a general rule: possession is 9/10 of the law. You're right, that's general merchandise, but something which is very common to lend out, to rent, like scissors, barber scissors, or the sifra galato, you would lend it out, they would really give it back, return it to you. Then the fact that it's by you proves nothing. It's like goydrus ein lechazok before, that goats wander into your household, or sheep wander into your household, proves nothing because they wander in. Something it's common could very well be. We know for a fact that it used to belong to Reuben, and it's common to lend it out. So how do we know it's yours? Says the Gemara, we would take it out of the assignment. They cannot prove that it's theirs. But what kind of thing we're talking about? Last thing we should generally you lend or you rent. Rent out. Why? This follows the rule of Rav Huna Baravi, and that's why Rav based himself on Rav Huna's din. Which are common to lend or rent. The kuchen and the yod, and you argue you bought it without any evidence. Ain't an he's not believed at all. Is kasha is a question. So why would Shmuel say that Rav was made to me? That was made to me in a case where the sons come along, the father died, and the sons come along and says, why? If we don't believe the father, because he worked there, therefore it's on his name, but that's nothing more than that, then why would the children be any different? If we have no evidence that ever passed on to the children, or that the father ever actually had the right, that he had funds, a source of funds, other than from his father directly. Second, when do we say that we don't believe the brother whose name is on all the contracts? They didn't divide the estate at all. But if they divide the estate at all, if they divided the estate, even a small amount, we can say that he somehow or another was able to save with a small amount that he got, and he invested, and that's where his. So if we can find a source of money that came from his father, and therefore we don't have to introduce some other variable, then we have to prove that he did not use that money and invest it to buy all those properties. Says the Gemara, okay, this Moshe Shane learned from here. We see the halacha is like Rav. I want that the brother whose name is on the contracts is not good enough. He has to prove that actually they're his and he had a source of funds other than directly from his father. But so we say that this brother has to bring a proof. What kind of proof does he need? His Rabbah says he has to bring witnesses that know for a fact that he had funds from elsewhere and he used that money to invest. And Rav Shesha says Raya B'kiyam Ashtar. Rav Shesha says that it's enough if he has a document that Bezdin stamped and approved and certified and said, yes, we saw this document that he bought the property, his name on it, and we certified that it's authentic. That's good enough. He doesn't have to even bring witnesses. Who is a student of Nachman, we have an argument. You have Harav, no Shmuel. You have Rav and Shmuel. Now we, according to Moshe Shani, we paskin like Rav. That the brother whose name is on it has to prove that he used other funds. But then Harav Sheshis, what kind of proof does he have to bring? We have two opinions. We have Rav and Sheshis. Who's the halacha like? Mar kemasrile. Who do you hold like? Amalek, I'm not going to respond. I know masnita yedaina. I know from a brisa the halacha is like Rav, but I don't have an opinion whether the halacha is like Rab or Rav Sheshes, whether you need witnesses or it's sufficient to have a document certified by the court. What is this brisa? I know masnita. I know brisa. Time we learned. Echad min achin. If one of the brothers who did all the transactions for the family. But how you owners starters, he had contract sales and he had loan contracts. They're all in his name. And Amar he claimed Shali and the mine. Based Avi Ima. And I yashnit from my mother's father, who's different than your mother, so it's mine. All of Avirai, he has to prove it. So clearly we see from here that the halach is like Rav. A woman, if she does, let's say, runs all the affairs of the house, and you had all of the same contracts going out there on her name, she said, that my name is on there, and therefore you should know that it's all, we're talking about a woman, a widow, so the husband is no longer alive, but she's running all the affairs of her children. She said, they're mine. And Shanofuli based Avi Abba that came from my family. My mother's side, my father's side. I just to prove it. What do you have to tell me that why should it be any different that you have to tell me the same thing applies to her? If she ran the affairs of the household and there was money there for the household, and then there's investment that she made on her own personal name, she has to prove that she used her own funds. No, I would have thought, and this is very interesting, when you use the same logic coming with two opposite conclusions. So first we have one conclusion based on this logic. I would have thought, Isha, the fact that she is still running the household and taking care of the orphans, she was appointed by the Bezdin. And you can imagine what kind of reputation she'll have, that she's an honest broker and that she's astute and she knows how to run a business, so it's very good for her. It gives her credentials. So why would she mess it up by stealing money embezzle money from the family funds? So therefore, we would have thought that that if she says, but it's my own money, she's telling the truth, because she wouldn't risk all that, her good name and goodwill for that purpose. That's what we would have thought. So I would have thought, Kiva, the Shchich is for her benefit. I worked so hard for these orphans. Like Gosla Miyasmus is definitely she didn't steal. Kamashla, no. We'll use the same logic for Ket. We'll say that since she's working for the orphans, she says to herself, I'm doing this gratis. I'm working so hard, and it's a thankless task. I don't appreciate it. Why shouldn't I make some money on the side? So she did use the same logic that she's working so hard for the Yisayimim. She says, therefore, I'm entitled to use some of the funds for myself. Then we said, the Mishnah continued. When do we say all this? By a marzik, abel benoisen matana, when somebody gives a gift, or a achin shechoku, when brothers divide an estate, they need to make a kinyan chazaka. And the kinyan chazaka was no part together. You close the door, part you breach the fence, together you fix the fence, and we'll discuss later what no means, or next time we learn Shabbos. Otu kol hani damrina la b'nei chazaka, and all these other ones. Kinyan isn't one of the forms of a kinyan is money, shtar, chazaka. So everyone is kinyan chazaka. What are you telling me about Medran Murim? The Mishnah is missing a couple of words. This is how I should learn. When is all this said? When do we say that you need 3 years? Chazaka, but taina there doesn't what we normally interpret means that you say 3 years plus I bought of you. Taina means that somebody is claiming that you have stolen property. So chazaka that has a taina, that's what we need. Somebody says accusing you of having stolen property, that's why you need 3 years. The seller says, I never sold it. The buyer says, I bought it. You need 3 years. If nobody complains, nobody argues. The vendor agrees or the buyer agrees, or he's giving a gift, or achin shecholku, or a machzim nischager. You're the sole person who's trying to buy it. The lemiknev almo, you're just trying to make a kinyan. So now we're talking about a kinyan chazaka. The format is either null, which literally would mean putting a lock or locking it, godar, fixing the fence, or paras, you breach the fence. Koshu, the slightest amount, hadezu chazaka. It's a valid chazaka. Big machreg is showing you what null means. Does null mean that you actually have to locking the door is good enough, or normally that you had to build something to lock. It's not enough just to put a lock in. So that's so external, extraneous the whole property, and you therefore have to do something to create a lock. Others say no, the fact that you're locking other people out, that in itself shows ownership. Others say no, that's called mavriya chari. You're preventing intruders from coming in. Doesn't mean that you're the owner. So machlek is what null means. Parats, breach in the fence, kosher. Bikidusha Rabbi learned in the Brises that he wrote on Masechta Kedusha. We have Rabbi Oishia, we have Rabbi Chia, we also have Rabbi Levi. So we learned that Levi also made Brises. No al God parts kosher b'fanav. Only if he did it in front of the vendor. Harezu chazak, it's a valid chazak. Fun of in shall lay b'fun of loy. It doesn't make sense. But only the vendor is standing there and you make a chazak, it's a valid kinyan, and the vendor is not there. It's not a valid kinyan. Why not? Rav explains Levi's words. If he did in front of the vendor, the vendor does not have to say to you, go out there and make your chazaka. The fact that what do you call it? If the vendor is standing there and he wants to sell to you and he sees you make chazaka and says nothing, that means he approves of this particular kinyan. But if let's say the vendor is not there, even though he wants to sell it, he has to tell you, because maybe he wants to change his mind, he wants to have a little bit more time to rethink or reconsider. So if he wasn't there, he needs to tell you, even if you paid money for it. We learned in other places that if the minig is to have a contract, then even if you paid money, it's not a sale yet until you actually write the contract. But you have to write the contract. So the money itself is not good enough. So if he must tell you to go make a kinyan. If he didn't tell you to go make a kinyan, then maybe he still wants to have a bit of time up his sleeve to change his mind. So boy, Rav asked the question, Matone Heich, what would it then be by a gift? By a gift as well, does he have to say, I'm gifting you? Does he have to say, go ahead and make a kinyan chazaka? Or the fact that he gave you a gift, that's good enough. You go ahead and make your kinyan. Amar Shmuel, sorry, so Amar Shmuel, I don't understand. What's Rav's question? The case of a sale. He received his money, so he has nothing to lose. Only if he gave him instructions, go make a chazaka good, and he so matana, where no money changed hands, like koshke, surely he has to tell him, go ahead, make chazaka. As long as he didn't tell me chazaka, even though he showed that he wants to give him matana, maybe he doesn't want him to be kind of. Matach, the case we received his money already, it's in his pocket. And yet he has to instruct him, go make a chazaka, surely here. But the Rav holds, man the yoy matone ba'ayin yofayoy. When you give someone, you're being very generous. Why give me a gift? Because you really like them, you want to be generous. So if you want to be generous, maybe you don't have to, part of the generosity is, I don't have to give him instruction because it's yours already. And therefore you don't have to tell him at all. That's the question. Okay, we'll stop over here.